examining From Trump to Biden, Reimagining U.S. China Relations. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Association for Diplomatic Study and Training's first in a series of virtual policy discussions. I'm Susan Johnson, the president of ADST. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us, ADST's business is history and diplomacy. We aim to strengthen public appreciation for diplomacy and enrich professional knowledge of practitioners by capturing, preserving, and sharing the experiences of America's diplomats in their own voices. We do this in two ways. First, through our extensive oral history collection, and secondly, through our support for authors who write about history and diplomacy. Our oral histories are accessible on our website and also on that of the Library of Congress. Today's policy discussion is first in a series featuring policy experts and authors who contribute to our work via their books and discussion like today's. I'm pleased now to warmly welcome Jane Perlez, former New York Times Beijing bureau chief. Jane will serve as our moderator and get us started. I'm sure we're in for a great discussion. Jane, over to you.
Thanks, Susan. And I'm really delighted to be moderating this panel. It's a top flight panel. Everyone has contributed to a really must-read book called From Trump to Biden, Reimagining U.S. China Relations. A great help in helping us understand the rapidly shifting dynamics of the economies of the two countries. And by the way, it's available in bookstores, and Christmas is coming soon. So what better for your friends who are interested in China? But before we get to the panelists, I just want to give a big plug to ADST. As a journalist, I found it absolutely invaluable. Before I went to China, I was a diplomatic correspondent in Washington, and we all knew that ADST was the place to go to for the stuff that no one would tell you when they were in office, but told you when they were out of office. And I also want to mention that for this podcast that I'm producing now on Nixon's visit to China 50 years ago, there are just some amazing historical interviews there, and we're using the audio, including one from the then ambassador to Pakistan, who organized for Kissinger to go into China on his first flight, secret trip, with a fedora and sunglasses at 3:30 in the morning. So it's that kind of detail that you can find in ADST oral histories. They really are must-reads. A little bit of housekeeping before we get to the roll call of the panelists. Please put your questions, as Susan mentioned, in the Q&A box. And about 20 minutes in, Earl, one of our panelists, will start a snap poll on what your attitudes are to U.S. China. So let me introduce the panelists. First, we have Andrew Tang. He's a partner at Draper Dragon Fund and Draper Associates. He invests in early stage technology companies and assists with their business developments, particularly international market entry strategy. He has more than 20 years in the investment fields of high tech. He moved to China and co-founded Draper Dragon in 2006. And today he's speaking to us from California, where his firm, I should have added, is a leading Silicon Valley fund. Matt Harris is on the investment team at Draper Associates. Before that, he was a vice president at the Blackstone Group, where he focused on providing growth financing to energy companies around the globe. He's a graduate of Texas A&M and is based in Austin, Texas, where he's speaking to us today. Kevin Chen is chief economist at Horizon Financial. He's a graduate of Renmin University in Beijing and has a master's in finance from Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And Earl Carr, he's the editor of Trump to Biden, Reimagining U.S. China Relations, the book that is the spine of our discussion today. He's a chief global strategist at Pivotal Advisors. He's based in New York City. He works with the firm's CEO to execute global research strategy. He has over 20 years of experience in the field. He's fluent in Chinese, is conversant in Japanese and Spanish, and he writes a great column for Forbes. Recommended reading. So let's go to you, Andy, and maybe you want to tell our attendees first about your race up the Empire State Building recently. I gather you and your colleague Matt went for the top. How did it go?
Oh, it was great. Highly recommended. We had it was a team exercise, and we're a global team at Draper Associates. So we had the California team racing against the New York team. So Matt and I won. We represented California team, but it's really, we're from Texas. So I call it the undercover Texas team, beat both New York and California.
Sounds like fun, a lot of fun. I gather you did it in 20 minutes. That seems to me pretty fast. How's that compared to the record?
The world record is 10 minutes. So we didn't really run up. We basically walked up without interruption. We skipped steps. Apparently that's the best strategy we read 2 days before the quote unquote race. And that sort of did the trick, is to walk briskly and without stopping.
Well, maybe a race is a good segue into our more serious topic today, which is US and China. That seems to be the mega race for the globe at the moment, I must say. So let me ask you this. Given the problems in the relationship, decoupling, the poor performance of the Shanghai Composite Index compared to the US S&P, how do you reassure people that China remains a good place to invest? Aren't there just too many risks compared to other places?
I think I'm going to dodge this question a little bit and see if you like the answer. If you don't like the answer, I can fine tune it. It's a good investment versus a bad investment. It's really in the eye of the beholder in terms of investment horizon.
Sure.
The way I look at it is that in the short run, the China environment is quite uncertain because of political reasons. But if you look at a longer investment horizon, it's still a growing economy with a strong middle class trying to grow up, increasing consumption. So it's still quite an interesting area to invest. I entered the China market in 2006. There has always been this worry of a black swan event from a political point of view. It is a pressure cooker, so it's very binary. It's either completely fine and you keep doing your thing, or one day something happens. And I believe we are closer to something happening today than 2006 when I started. So I do think if you take a long enough investment horizon, if you talk to some of the more of our investors in the endowment world where they have long investment horizon, it's still an interesting place to participate in growth. But if you're talking to more of our hedge fund colleagues that are looking at quarter by quarter, it is a little bit more dicey.
You mentioned you thought that something was about to happen. Do you mean politically, economically?
Yeah. I mean social unrest, right? It's basically one of those things when you have a one-party rule and essentially one-person rule. It's very binary. You could have a one person keep everything under control, but something could happen. We just don't know when. Certainly today versus 2006, there's a bit more rumbling. Yeah.
Gosh, I have to ask. I mean, I've asked Chinese colleagues, what's the chance for social unrest? Because you think living in the West that there are all the ingredients for it, but given the system, it's hard to imagine it. And my Chinese colleagues, to a person, say zero because of the nature of the system. What would you say?
Right. I would say, Matt and I are in the space of early stage investing. We always sort of bet on these low probability but big outcome that has a a reasonable expected value. So this is a low probability event, but it has a significant outcome. So I actually think from a statistical point of view, as a investor, you have a non-zero impact on the outcome, right? So it's unlikely to happen black swan event, but if it does happen, huge impact.
So in that context, I think it would be really interesting if you could tell our attendees about some of your investments, some of the companies that you've invested in and how they have performed historically, like, for example, upay.com, Ledge, FMD.
Yeah, so we actually have been very fortunate this year. So I've been in business for 20 years. I've had seeded 10 unicorn companies, valuation exceeding $1 billion. And 5 of those were actually China related, reflecting the first part of my career. The other 5 were more digital and blockchain related companies. So the first 5 out of China, we actually had one company went public last week on the Shanghai Stock Exchange.
Which one was that?
Jingjing Electric. So they're in the electric motor business. So they are a leading supplier of electric motors for EV in China, and they also export to the U.S. So that's an example of a company where we invested in 2007, took 14 years, and finally, they were able to get to a point that were large enough to be listed on the Shanghai Star Market. Essentially, it's a designed for high-tech, high-growth companies. And we started with a Cayman structure, thinking it would go public on NASDAQ, and then obviously a few years ago, NASDAQ wasn't really welcoming EV companies. There are now, it was SPACs. So we then a few years ago repatriated back to China, and then they went public in the Shanghai Stock Exchange.
Matt, let's turn to you in Texas. You had this interesting chapter in the book that opens the book about a roadmap in which you argue how the U.S. should follow, what the U.S. should do in order to maintain its leadership in manufacturing, tech, and innovation. Tell us about the roadmap and what are the essential components of it to keep the U.S. competitive against China.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. It's great to be here. Thanks to all the listeners. I was looking at it this morning and I was trying to think about how best to capture, what the 5 steps represent. And I think at a high level, it's really a plan to maximize freedom for entrepreneurs. And I'll come back to that over and over again. I think it's about removing, our entrepreneurs' reliance on unreliable partners. It's about giving them the access to the best technologies and optimizing the labor pool, and then giving them cash runway to be the superheroes that they are. So I think that's the ethos of the plan is set the human spirit free in the U.S. And the components of the plan are one, we need to ID a minimum viable industrial capacity. I think COVID has really showed us that we are lacking a little bit there, particularly the areas I highlight are semiconductors, microchips, and active pharma agents, ingredients. We need to procure access to reliable and abundant supplies of natural resources and do it in a way that promotes freedom and partnership, which is what China is doing. And so I think that's important. We need to fill the skills gap. There's a large skills gap between where we are today and where we want to be. So I think that requires changes in education, in the way we train people, and I think also immigration. I'm not an expert in immigration policy, but I have noticed talking to a lot of immigrants that, just as an example, we need to let immigrants be business owners. Just as an example, like I don't know where that changes, but I talk to a lot of immigrants who, have to be consultants or whatever, and allowing these brilliant people to come in and be sole proprietors, I think just makes sense to me. And then fourth, is invest and kind of clear the runway for investing. And so I think, the plan, it requires everybody needs to be involved. It's multilateral, it's public-private partnerships. I think the government can provide grants and policy clarity. And then from there, in my opinion, investors, entrepreneurs, and nonprofits can kind of take over and just be, you know, let the human spirit go and don't get in the way. That's how I view it.
Do you think the United States is lagging badly in this roadmap that you outlined?
I don't know.
Your comments just now, it sounds as though that's the way you feel.
I don't know. I mean, I think of it. Andy may be better to speak on the relative comparison on an absolute basis. We have a lot of work to do. That's for sure. And so on an absolute basis, there's, you know, when I just think about in the U.S. where we are versus where we could be, and then Andy or Kevin may be able to better speak on a relative basis. There's a lot of improvement to make in all these areas, and there's a lot of entrepreneurs waiting in the wings to make the improvements. So,
given that, I want to ask you. You must be familiar with it's almost a slogan now by Kai-Fu Lee, the AI expert in China. He says basically that China is set to become the Saudi Arabia of artificial intelligence. Do you buy his line?
I think so. My opinion so far, my experience is there's two very distinct types of artificial intelligence. There's artificial narrow intelligence and artificial general intelligence. And artificial narrow intelligence seems like it will become a commodity. To be honest, there won't be so I guess, and no country will have, I think, a monopoly like Saudi Arabia has on oil. And then there's AGI, which is from where I sit doesn't exist yet. You know, I get to demo a lot of products for early stage companies who are working on AGI, and it's just not there yet. And so I don't know. I think there's a big difference between marginal innovation and breakthrough innovation, and I think getting to AGI is a breakthrough innovation. That will be very hard. It will be very hard for China to make breakthrough innovations with the setup that they've moved towards. Just because breakthrough innovation is a product of freedom. You know, there's a ton of marginal innovations that can have a huge impact. Like as an example, you know, just continually improving artificial narrow intelligence can have a huge impact. But you know, China won't have a monopoly on that. Becoming the Saudi Arabia of AI would require a breakthrough in artificial general intelligence, and I don't think that requires freedom, in my opinion. So I don't think that they can pull that off in the current state. I'd love to hear what the other panelists think about that one, because that was sort of a big statement.
Does anybody else want to say anything on this question of whether Kai-Fu Lee is a sort of hyping a dream, or whether China might get close to this? What about you, Andrew?
So I'd like to sort of bring that other dimension of artificial intelligence, which is it's about the AI model and how you built it, but the model needs to be trained by data. So the real question is, which government could collect a lot of data and train their model to behave more like human? And I think by asking that question, you could probably come with your own answer. Who is collecting a lot of data? Maybe I'll just leave it at that.
So maybe this is the point where Earl should come in with his snap poll of the attendees. I hand it over to you, Earl.
Sure. Before I do the poll, first and foremost, thank you so much, Susan, for your extraordinary leadership at ADST, and thank you, Jane, for moderating. I have read tons of your articles in the New York Times, and so I'm thrilled to be able to finally meet you and to be on this panel and for you to be moderating. So first, just a quick anecdote on just AI and just inventions. So I was on a webinar with a professor at MIT, and he said, if you look at the whole ecosystem of inventions and compare them between the United States and China, China currently has 85,000 patents for new inventions since inception. Currently, the United States has 35,000 inventions currently. And I think Andrew made a really good point about data. And when you look at the ecosystem of how data is developing and how much China has been able to has that unique advantage with respect to data. I think that has some important implications for the future. But on that note, we will go ahead and start the poll, which is a really interesting exercise to get a pulse of kind of what public opinion is like. So we'll give a second for the poll to come up, which it is right now. Everyone, including panelists, are welcome to take the poll, and moderator, you are welcome to take as well, to answer these questions. And so feel free to answer these questions, and we will go ahead and start going through the answers when we have about 85–90% participation rate. So I'll give you guys a second. While we do that, I'll also just state while we utilize this time, I had the privilege of traveling to China for the first time in 1998. And Jane and Andrew and Kevin probably know this more than many, that when you talk about China, it's so critically important to talk about context. When I went to China for the first time in 1998, I lived in a foreign student dormitory in Beijing Normal University. There was one phone for 20 people in our dorm. And in 1998, my sister had given birth to her first child. And so I waited for 25 minutes to be able to hear my nephew's baby's little voice on a phone. 20 years later, I am working at HSBC Bank in Shanghai. I'm traveling on a high-speed railway using internet, a strong Wi-Fi connection, and I'm using a Wi-Fi connection that gives me better connection because it avoids the Chinese firewall. And I'm using a phone that was manufactured in a province in China that produces the vast majority of iPhones. And so I think it's critically important when you look at the development, the extraordinary development of China. China has always looked at parity with the United States, not only for legitimacy within the party, but more importantly, for China's own development. You saw this in many ways in the 1960s with nuclear technology and development. Just today in the New York Times, Jane, a publication you know well, there was an article that said that the new Pentagon reports that China should have about 1,000 nuclear weapons by the year 2030. So when you look at parity, whether that be in nuclear technology during the 60s, or if you look at China's accession into the WTO in the 1980s, or even if you look at the whole competition in terms of artificial intelligence now, I think it's really critically important that you understand that drive and that quest for parity is something that has both incorporated competition as well as cooperation, both between the United States and China. And that was one of the central ethoses of this book, which really, if I could sum it up in a nutshell, is that China and the United States, as two of the largest economies in the world, need to find ways to cooperate on a vast array of international and transnational issues. And when the United States and China cannot cooperate, there is a huge cost to societies, there's a huge cost to governments, and we saw this most recently in the Trump administration with the trade war. There was a huge cost to consumers. There was a huge cost to entrepreneurs and investors, being able, both Chinese investors being able to invest in the US economy, for US investors wanting to invest in the Chinese economy. And so I think it's critically important that we are at a unique inflection point between the United States and China, and that we need more communication, we need more cooperation. That doesn't mean that we have to agree on a vast array of issues. We probably can't agree on things like human rights or where COVID came from, but that should not preclude us from trying to find common ground on important transnational issues.
Earl, should we go ahead with a couple of questions to Kevin Chen, or do you want to keep going with the poll? Or
sure, let's I think most people should have already completed the poll. So if we could ask our colleagues to show the results of the poll, and then Jane, if you would like to go with Kevin. So I'll read the first question. Are you concerned in the future direction of U.S.-China economic relations? 85% of the people on this call said a resounding yes. And I think that seems in line with what we've seen in the last 4 years and elsewhere. There's been a lot more friction in the US and China economic relation. If we look at question number 2, are you optimistic of the future in US-China economic engagement? 40% of our respondents said yes, 30% said no, 20% said very concerned, 10% said not sure. That seems to be in line. Question number 3, what issues are you most concerned about in US-China relations? 40% said a potential military conflict in the South China Sea or Taiwan. 40% equally said stealing of intellectual property and or cybersecurity attacks. 65% said an economic trade war, which can hurt both American and Chinese consumers. And another 60% said the rising populism and nationalism in both America and China. All right, those percentages don't quite add up to 100. So we will definitely have to check up on that later. But moving along, question number 4, what issue are you most optimistic about in US-China relations? 25% said the promotion of cultural exchanges between the US and China, such as study abroad. That's fair. 55%, this is interesting, said engagement on climate change and clear energy technology. That's surprising, but that's great to hear. And I think this really rides off COP26 and the meetings there and the important emphasis on the need to cooperate on environmental change. 10% said engagement and cooperation in combating transnational issues. And another 10% said provider of labor-intensive goods and services to American consumers. Question number 5, which is really an interesting and provocative question. Do you believe China will be the strongest global economy in the world by 2030? 55% said yes, 10% said no, 35% said not sure. All right, interesting data. I'll hand it over to you, Jane.
Yeah, very interesting data. I mean, kind of interesting that people are not so worried about military accidents in the South China Sea and more worried about the economy and trade. I think that's probably because they're closer to home. But having lived in Beijing until 2 years ago, I've got to say that the chances of an accident somewhere in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait is really worrying, given the mood in both capitals. So kudos to you, Earl, for talking up the need for engagement, which is necessary, but at the moment seems a hard path. I wonder if I could turn to Kevin. I don't want to be too much of a downer here, but Kevin, I'd like to ask you about Xi Jinping's one of his favorite phrases. He seemed to have many these days, but one of his favorite phrases is common prosperity. What the hell does this mean? And how is this going to affect the Chinese economy and the competition between the US and China on economic things?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. First, I really appreciate this opportunity to share, with our audience about the book and about the chapter I wrote. About the common prosperity. I guess you're right. It is pretty much a buzzword right now, mainly in China. I guess there are many answers or many points to be point out to this question. I guess there are positives and negatives. I guess first, from implementation point of view, I think this common prosperity idea or policy has been put out in a rush and created a lot of I would say negative consequences. In particular, essentially that whole idea was, you want to make people to be more equal, which part of it was essential to crack down on the education or private education sector. So essentially several $100 billion worth of education companies who are traded on the US, stock price plunged probably from 80 to 95% or 97% loss. So that's a massive, massive hit to an industry, got wiped out because essentially, supposedly the private education sectors are creating more equal outcome, for the kids. So I think that's the, I would say one of the main, negative consequences from this policy. But also, if we look at the background, I think COVID or what happened after COVID globally, not only in China, is a massive, massive, inequality. The wealth distribution, I think, in China is probably much worse than other countries in the sense that there are a lot of people got really, they got their savings wiped out. They lost job. They're very unhappy, and you got some of those tycoons who are, who have been doing extremely well. I guess like any other countries, COVID essentially created more wealth for the, for the tech billionaires, for the people who can in fact participate in the stock market rally globally. And so I think the whole common prosperity idea was really about how to redistribute wealth or to, make the society to be more equal. So I guess my answer is that it's an idea out of good intention. However, it was implemented in a very brutal way and caused a lot of damages to the private sector.
Yeah, if I could just mention, when you look at the term common prosperity in Chinese, it's 共同富裕. And implicit within that, I think it's really important to understand this notion of redistribution of wealth, but it's also important that the Chinese government is acknowledged that there are companies like Alibaba that actually, when you look at the sheer size of these companies, are actually bigger than certain economies around the world. And as these companies became so large and powerful, there was a growing recognition that some of these profits should actually go back to helping the Chinese government as well as helping ordinary citizens. And so I think you see with Jack Ma and Alibaba in particular, he kind of ran afoul by making a number of comments that the Chinese government should implement faster economic reforms. And so in many ways, he was taught a kind of lesson in many ways, and was asked to give philanthropically back to the Chinese government and back to society. So I think that there is this important better equilibrium where companies should be giving back more to both civil society as well as to the government.
Kevin, if I could, just another thought here. You had this really provocative chapter in Reimagining U.S. China Relations. I think one of the questions that comes up for investors is the experience of the coffee chain, Luckin Coffee, which I remember very well from my years in Sanlitun. I mean, they opened 2 stores just 50 yards from each other. It was amazing. And, the New York Times Bureau was full of Luckin coffee because it was so cheap. Our researchers said, well, it doesn't taste that great, but the price is fantastic. But anyway, the bottom line is that there's a lot of fraud. So how do American investors get, how do they get trust back into Chinese companies given the experience of Luckin?
Sure. Yeah, that is a good example about what the regulations should be done. In fact, I think most of those, not most, but I think a lot of those Chinese companies who came to be traded on the U.S. exchanges, they did not have strong internal control, transparency, following the U.S. PCAOB, audit standard, etc. So there was a lacking of internal control and a lacking of disclosure. A lot of area needs to be improved. And that's why I wrote this chapter, essentially kind of, similar to, I guess you guys probably know this well, right? The President Reagan's idea of trust but verify, in the sense that, yes. So these are the, I would say some of those companies are world-class companies, and we should welcome them to be part of New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, to help essentially for, the U.S. capital market to be the world center for trading. But on the other hand, we really need to enforce all those regulations, transparencies, requirements, etc. Because as of now, there is really a lacking of the enforcement. We don't need to go the extreme of what essentially President Trump was trying to do a couple of years ago, complete blank kick out of all those companies. That will be a major loss to the US economy. It will be very bad for Chinese economy for sure, but it will be a lose-lose. And but to keep the status quo of let's say for the last 20, 30 years of essentially let them come, but we don't, let's say apply the same standard as the American public traded companies on New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, is not sustainable either. You have to get those, financial statement to be in the global accepted standard, and then protect investors' interest, and still welcome those high quality companies. And so I'm hoping that this chapter can contribute to the debate right now. I think on Wall Street, basically, about what are we going to do with this roughly 500 companies with roughly maybe $1 to $2 trillion market cap. You cannot completely kick them out, but you cannot keep them as it is. So maybe more enforcement makes them a better company. That will be very good for the US economy. That will be very good for the Chinese economy, and also for the consumers. And just like you said, when I went to China last time, which was 3 years ago, the only coffee I had was Luckin Coffee, because it is cheap and they do free delivery, which I couldn't imagine. How can you do a free delivery of a $2 coffee?
How did it
to your
taste?
office?
How did it taste?
I think just average coffee, let's say. It's just like New York Deli. It's definitely not, a gourmet coffee from Starbucks or something. It's just average coffee. Yeah.
So, Earl, I know that you're anxious to talk a little bit more about this engagement theme, but and I'm all for it too, but explain to us how this can happen given the mood in Congress, the mood in the White House, and frankly, candidly, the mood in Zhongnanhai. I mean, look, Xi didn't even turn up to Glasgow, and he sent some faint words, but not very much. So even on climate, which you name as one of the paths to this engagement, it looks pretty grim. So what's your recipe?
Well, I think it's clearly, one, I agree 100% with what you said, that the mood and the sentiment currently on Capitol Hill is extraordinarily acrimonious. There are voices both within Beijing as well as it seemed both Democrats and Republicans seem to be quite united on the fact that, we should have harder policy on China. And I think you saw that particularly when Biden came into office. When Biden came into office, he was under enormous pressure to prove that he was not going to be a continuation of the Obama policies. He had to prove to Congress that he was going to be tough and harder on China. And so as a result, he had to take a fundamentally different type of approach and actually continued a lot of the policies that were implemented under the Trump administration, particularly around trade, sanctions, et cetera, as important kind of sticks that were levers and leverage. And so I think that it's critically important that when you look at the history of both cooperation and competition with China, there have always been fractious elements in the relationship. But it's critically important that when we look at things like large scale decoupling, that would be catastrophic for both the United States and China's economy. And no one is really arguing for that. If you ask Chinese entrepreneurs, if you ask American entrepreneurs and businesses, they don't want large-scale economic decoupling, because they understand the ramifications of what that would be and that do for their consumer bases. But I think it is important. What we've seen is kind of limited or targeted decoupling in certain industries that are sensitive towards national security, and we can understand and have that open and honest and transparent debate with our colleagues in China. But I think the broader issue is that we need to continue to find common ground on issues that have historically always supported U.S.-China relations, on trade, on investment, on cultural exchanges. I think it is critically important that we foster and support American students studying abroad in China and vice versa. The U.S. economy has gained so much from Chinese engineers that have studied and then come to work in the United States. I think we need to further immigration policies that continue to support that important evolution and drive of the U.S. economy. Another important area, as I mentioned, is environment, but more importantly, environmental technologies. I think it's important for companies like GE to be able to develop good and important clean technologies that support initiatives like the Belt and Road. When you look at how much cement is going to be put in the atmosphere in China through these large infrastructure projects, there's a huge opportunity, I believe, for American companies to be able to work in concert in China in terms of finding common ground there. And I hope that with all the minutia and the noise politically, I hope that does not damper our commitment and our intentional drive to find common ground on these broader important issues.
So thanks, Earl. We have one question here from, I guess, a former professor of yours, Stephen Ashkenazi. He asks, what long-term or more permanent measures would you suggest Biden make in negotiating with China as an insurance policy against a heaven forbid reemergence of Trump in 2024? Andrew Tang, do you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, that is one loaded question. Maybe I'll decouple that. I'll probably leave the second piece.
Yes,
I'm not an expert in the next election, but I can say from where I sit, in fostering entrepreneurship, innovation, commerce, I really think, to Earl's point, you just cannot decouple, and it won't. I could almost guarantee you these two economies won't decouple, because I think that's a safe bet for mutual destruction, right? So I don't think it's going to happen. And the reason why it won't happen is because political leaders, their instinct is to sort of keep their influence and their votes. And in order to keep their votes and influence, you do want to make sure people continue to work and have jobs and can buy things without overpaying, maintaining your quality of life. In order for that to happen, we have no choice but to collaborate. We may not even like each other, right? But I think we'll kind of enter into this, you could call this a temporarily unhappy marriage. But I don't think there's no divorce law. You can't just say no fault divorce, you take 50-50, you're stuck. But I do think you're stuck, you're better off than when you were before. You're just complaining about the little things. And I think the way you repair the relationship is to figure out, all right, so maybe we got married too young, we didn't know what we were doing. Now let's re-examine what's important for us, right? America, I think we have inadvertently exported too many manufacturing jobs. So let's take some back. What's the big deal? In China, there's still a lot of growth, a lot of demand. So give some manufacturing jobs to the US, no big deal. So I do think maybe there's a lot of chest pounding. People are not happy in the last 4 years, but there is a amicable and very easy way to kind of get back on the table and find win-wins, because there's still hundreds of millions of Chinese consumers ready to buy. Let's just sort of harness that energy and sell them stuff.
We have another question from Lu Fang. He says the following: in my naive observation, the current supply chains and inflation issues we are having now have a lot to do with the trade war on China. How come in the US no one sees this elephant in the room? Who would like to tackle that?
Kevin, as a chief economist, would you like to take that one, or I'm happy to jump in?
Sure, I'm happy to chime in some. Yeah, I think the whole current supply chain issue, inflation, has a lot of driving factors behind. I would say probably one key thing is actually labor shortage. Supply chain, it's right now you are seeing lack of truck drivers, for example, right? You see those containers are piling up at the ports in California, ports in North and South Carolina, and in the Gulf Coast. Why they are not being delivered to the destination, right? It's about labor shortage. So that has really not much to do with China or with the trade war. That's one. The second, I think it's about because COVID. Really, COVID probably reduced a lot of the production last year and early this year. Even look at lumber, for example. What I've heard is that the lumber yard for the past season, they did not have a lot of people to go in because of COVID restriction, and which caused a major shortage. And also you look at copper, like other minerals production. Last year, there was a halt of a lot of mining operation globally. That has nothing to do with U.S.-China trade war either. And so these are the reasons. Yes, I would say the U.S.-China trade war in 2019, it was a contributing factor to the inflation here in the U.S. clearly. However, I think right now the whole supply chain chaos, a lot of issues right now. I think it's more about the domestic labor shortage, and the COVID caused supply disruption. And I think it's going to be cured slowly over the next 12 months probably, and with more people going back to the workforce, and with more production coming back online. And hopefully, if the tension between US and China would be, let's say, would be moving toward less of an issue, that would be helpful to reduce the inflation crashing here too. But I would say it will be a combination of a lot of things.
We have a last question from an attendee, but I think that I would really like, if I can, to ask a quick round question to the four panelists on the word that's on everybody's mind when it comes to China-US, and that's Evergrande. Andrew, what impact is this real estate, it can only be called a disaster, I guess, but maybe you disagree, this real estate problem, what effect is it going to have on the Chinese economy?
So I think in this case, I don't know if people are familiar with the situation. Essentially, you have a real estate company that keeps taking on debt to a point where I would call it's a Chinese version of the too big to fail. And then to my surprise, the Chinese government actually had a lot of discipline and resolve and say, we're gonna just maybe not help you and see what happens. And so they were playing this, they took the brinkmanship to the extreme, and miraculously the company actually was able to meet the interest payment. I have a feeling nothing is going to come out of it. In other words, nothing bad, because historically Chinese government has been really good at making sure they make domestic investors whole. In this case, it's foreign investors, but I do think that's where my prediction is. Optics are important, right? You don't want to lose face. How embarrassing would it be if a big Chinese company misses interest payment? So I think somehow everything will be fine, but it probably won't be the kind of Congress, live testimony, let's have a bailout bill. I think it's probably going to be more subtle behind the doors. Miraculously, there is a white knight, no pun intended, rescue that happens in the back room. And then we don't know who's coming in to rescue, but probably not official, CIC investing in the company. That's my prediction. So I actually feel, it's just a brinkmanship on both sides.
Matt, what do you think? Do you agree with Andrew, or have you got a different take on it?
Yeah, I think I generally agree. I mean, I think the government is sort of trying to walk this very fine line between creating moral hazard and then also not causing a Lehman event. And so I don't think you can. I think that's a fine line that's going to need to be walked for much longer, just to see what have other companies done, what's the overall debt situation. That can't be isolated to one company, I don't think. And so I think it's going to take some time to unravel. But I always try to keep it. It's important to keep in mind, especially during times like this. I always think a slogan that's seared into my mind is bears sound smart and bulls make money. And so I always try to I always try to keep the optimistic view that like Andy said, think that it'll play out okay.
Kevin, are you as optimistic?
Probably not as much. So I'm respectfully putting my opinion, which I think the situation is much worse than people think. And I don't think it's just the Evergrande issue. It's an issue of the whole real estate industry in China. I guess the big picture is China is aging rapidly. The total number of working population in China peaked in 2015. Since 2016 has been rapidly declining. So you got less of people who are willing to buy apartments, buy housing. And that's really an uphill battle that I think most real estate developers pretend not to see, or they saw it, but they basically decided, let us borrow as much as we can first. And now, it's a whole industry is going through a default restructuring, which means a lot of people are losing their jobs, a lot of people are losing their savings. And if you look at the last 2 months, each month, the housing purchase activity declined 30% in China. So it is hurting the industry, hurting, real estate is a big industry in China, not only real estate itself, but the suppliers, for example, the construction equipment makers, and the brokers industry, etc. in China. So it is, I think, having a major impact. And if you look at macroeconomic data in China right now, it's very weak. PMIs are below 49, 48 range. So the substantial slowdown, I think, it's because of the real estate sector in trouble, as headline covered about Evergrande, but there are a lot more other real estate companies are not able to pay their debt.
Given what you've just said, I can't resist asking, I know we've got to end, but given that, what do you think this whole disaster, for want of a better word, in the real estate industry that you've described, how will that contribute to social unrest?
People are not happy, for sure, and so let's there are a lot of people who lost a lot of saving. They probably saved a long time trying to buy an apartment right now, and they put the down payment, and apparently they're not going to get an apartment, right? So what are you going to do? So I think it is pretty negative consequence. What would happen, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, one thing we do know is that the boss of Evergrande will no longer be shopping for a $100 million yacht. That seems for sure. Mm-hmm. Earl, do you want to have the last word on Evergrande, and then over to Susan for closing?
Sure. I just want to expand on 2 points. If Andy and maybe Matt are on one side, and maybe Kevin is extreme, I'm maybe in the middle, and just expand on that concept of moral hazard. I think when you look at Chinese companies, ordinary Chinese citizens or companies that are saying, look, if Evergrande's going to get a bailout, the next Chinese company that goes under, in the psyche of the Chinese government is like, are we going to be under pressure to bail them out. So I think what Andy said is spot on in terms of the Chinese government, not stepping in, being very prudent on how they're handling it, because they do not want Evergrande to default, because like we said, it would have a huge, in terms of face for the Chinese government, it would not bode well. But I think the broader implications, right, when we put things, and if I can use an analogy, when you look at the whole anti-Wall Street, a phenomenon that occurred, when Lehman went under, a lot of ordinary citizens in the US were like, well, where's my bailout, right? You can, with a population of 300 million in the United States, imagine 1.4 billion people asking, where's my bailout if something like that were to happen in China? So I think it's critically important that we understand that dynamic. And the last point is that I think the broader implications are that the real estate component comprises about 30% of China's GDP. And that has started to slow. And so if the real estate, which has been such an important part of the engine of China's growth, is slowing, where is the future growth going to be developing for China's economy? I think that's the broader question.
Boy, that's a really provocative way to end. We'll see what the answers are, especially given Xi Jinping's, what can we say, ideological insistence on, it seems to be insistence on common prosperity. Susan, over to you.
Well, thank you. And this sort of sets us up for the next issue in the next installment in the series, because we're kind of leaving on a cliffhanger. But as a non-China expert and just listening to this last bit of the discussion on Evergrande, I was thinking, where's Jack Ma and Alibaba? Isn't that the kind of white knight that can redeem himself by somehow restoring the situation and saving face? But what do I know? Anyway, I won't take more time, but I'd just like to say on behalf of ADST and all of us, I want to thank you for this really informed and instructive session, especially for me. I learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to a pretty painless way of learning a lot more in successive installments. And I'd like to invite our participants and all of you to visit ADST's website. Consider subscribing to our weekly newsletter. Recommend us to friends, colleagues, or anyone you think might be interested in a kind of monthly dose of information about U.S. diplomatic history, which is also global diplomatic history by its very nature, in easily digestible form. So we rely on the generosity of supporters as a nonprofit and people who are just inspired by our nonpartisan mission of capturing, preserving, sharing the experiences of America's diplomats and trying to ensure that our diplomats are as well informed as possible. Listening to you, I'm wishing the best for US and Chinese diplomats in explaining to their respective political masters what the issues are and the intricacies and and the pros and cons, and that they're able to do it in a really informed way with great perspective. If you're joining us for the first time, it would be great if you'd signal your support for our mission, either by becoming a member, which we always welcome, or just by giving a donation in any amount as an expression of support for our work, including discussion series of this type. So we look forward to your participation in other sessions of this series. And thank you again to Jane, to all of you panelists, and to all our participants. So with that, this event is officially over. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Here.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.